It is day 2 of offensive position rankings week here on the channel. Yesterday was wide receiver day, and today is tight end day. And this is, at least in my opinion, one of the deepest tight end classes that we have seen in quite some time. Obviously, there's no Kyle Pitts in this class because most years do not have a Kyle Pitts in them. He was considered generational for a reason, but at least in terms of total number of guys in this group that I think could be at minimum contributors in the league and possibly even stars in the league, there's still an above average number of that in this class relative to most years. In fact, I would say there's at least 5 or 6 in this group that have the potential, keyword potential, in order to become stars. So there's a lot of names that we have to get to today, and once again, I broke them out into tiers, tier 1 through tier 4. And if you're interested in any other names, the super late round sleepers, the UDFAs, or just quite frankly, the freaks with upside that may or may not go in day 3 that teams are going to take a chance on, head on over to the podcast channel, the Bootleg Football Podcast. We have a whole bunch of episodes dedicated to exactly that type of content. And in addition to that, we're doing a draft live stream in all 3 days of the draft. It's going to be roughly 19 to 22 hours of commercial-free live draft content. We're going to be talking about every single pick. We will not miss any players at all. It's going to be wild. We're getting a house down by the beach. It's going to be unlike probably any other draft broadcast out there. So if you're interested in hanging out with us during all of draft weekend, go subscribe to the Bootleg Football Podcast channel, turn on notifications, all that kind of stuff. That is where we are going to be streaming it. So with that all being said, why don't we dive into tier 1 of my 2022 tight end rankings, which conveniently is a tier of exactly one player. UCLA's Greg Dulcich is the only tight end that I have in tier 1 this year, but I don't want that to imply that there's a massive gap between him and all the others that I have in tier 2. I just kind of wanted to differentiate him from the rest of the pack because he does kind of have a unique skill set, or rather a unique blend of traits compared to the rest of this class. When you look at Dulcich, he does have that typical Y tight end size, 6'4", 6'5", 250 plus. He does bring a lot of size and physicality to the position, but unlike a lot of the other tight ends in this class that are of similar size, he also brings vertical ability to the pass game. Dulcich is a legit seam ripper down the field, and I kind of want you to ignore the 4.7 that he ran at the combine because there were multiple teams that actually had him timed like low 4.6, and one of them even had him at 4.6 flat, and typically teams just kind of go with whatever times are on their own watches. So trust me, he is faster than that 4.7 time. He's also really, really good after the catch. I think he can do a lot of damage in the screen game. I think he's a better route runner than he's given credit for. There was a touchdown he had against Washington on a stick nod that I thought was just absolutely beautiful. And I also think that he's at least functional as a blocker. I don't necessarily think it's a lack of effort thing. I just think that, maybe he could stand to put on like 10 more pounds and kind of refine technique a little bit. I do think that he at least tries as a blocker, though, which is more than I can say for a lot of other dudes in this class. So just kind of looking at the total package here, size, speed, physicality, polish as a route runner, great hands, tracks the deep ball super well. He just kind of brings a vertical element to the wide tight end spot that nobody else in this class really does, and so I think he's worth putting in a tier all to his own. And that brings us to tier 2 of all these tight ends. We have Cade Otton, Trey McBride, Jake Ferguson, Charlie Kolar, and Jelani Woods. A lot of these guys are also going to be kind of, stereotypical wide tight ends, really good in the run game, especially Cade Otton, Trey McBride, and Jake Ferguson. They're all really good blockers. Cade Otton and McBride in particular are probably the most physical of them, while Ferguson I think is a little bit better of a blocker in space. But all of them are fantastic wide tight end prospects. All of them I think have really good hands. I also think they have enough speed to be a legitimate threat in the seam, even if it's not quite to the same gear of Greg Dulcich. McBride is a little bit smaller, but I also think that he might be the most ferocious blocker out of all of them. Just kind of watching how he plays. I mean, he is 100 miles an hour every single snap. Really, really ultra physical. I almost kind of like him, even though he did play wide tight end. I kind of like him almost as like a bulked up Kyle Juszczyk, if that makes sense. Like I almost want him as an H-back, somebody on the move who can do kick out blocks in addition to also lining up on the line of scrimmage and doing all the wide tight end stuff. I think that he could really thrive in that sort of role. And Cade Otton, by the way, I do think has a legitimate shot to be one of the first 3 tight ends drafted, even though nobody's talking about him because he was kind of out of sight, out of mind with some injuries. But when you watch his tape, I think he's a really, really competitive blocker. I think he's a very underrated two-way player. I think he's going to slide right in at the Y spot for some lucky team and probably play there for several years. And beyond that trio of kind of stereotypical inline tight ends, I also included in Tier 2 Charlie Kolar and Jelani Woods. Kolar is not like everybody else in this group. He's kind of worthless as a blocker at the moment, but he is extraordinarily physically gifted. Like, he moves very similarly to Travis Kelce, in my opinion. He's not as well-rounded as Kelce whatsoever, but I think if you can at least teach him to get in the way as a blocker and be functional in that space, I do think that he could bring a lot of value as kind of that type of tight end that's really more of a big slot receiver, or if you kind of want to split him out as an X while you put all the other wide receivers in trips on the other side, like what the Chiefs do with Kelce, he can do that as well. He's a really good route runner, a really good receiving tight end prospect. He's got a massive frame, really good hips, really quick feet, all the kind of stuff that you love to see from a receiving tight end. He just provides damn near negative value as a blocker, in my opinion. I do not think he's physical whatsoever in that realm. I think people get under his pads really easily. I just kind of want him as a big slot, and that's probably about it. And then last in this tier, I couldn't not put Jelani Woods in here. He is massive. He is fast. Again, he is another one of these tight ends that I think does bring a vertical element similar to Greg Dulcich, but I don't necessarily think he's as fluid as Greg Dulcich, and I do think that Dulcich tracks and catches the ball a little bit better as well. So Woods theoretically could get to that level. I think he has that kind of ceiling. I mean, I've compared him to some very lofty names. I just think it's a little bit of a safer bet that Greg Dulcich gets there, whereas Jelani Woods is more of a, take him and hope he gets there, but it's just, again, not quite as safe of a bet. I think he's a very, very promising prospect. I think he has an extraordinarily high ceiling. There's just a little bit more boom or bust to his game, in my opinion. Oh, and I also do think he's a little bit more functional of a blocker than Charlie Kolar, but that's not really saying much. Everybody is a more functional blocker than Charlie Kolar. But yeah, overall, Tier 2, got some really good two-way tight ends that you can put on the line of scrimmage. They block really well. They played against some top competition. They're very physically gifted. And other than Kolar, I would probably trust all of them to start at that Y spot pretty early on in their career. And that brings us to Tier 3, which is only 2 names, believe it or not, and that is Jeremy Ruckert and Chig Okonkwo. I've talked about Okonkwo before. He kind of profiles as like a hybrid tight end, H-back, fullback, big slot receiver type guy. A lot of, Kyle Juszczyk energy coming from his tape. I think he's a very versatile player. He's a very tenacious blocker. He's a tremendous athlete. I'm talking like low 4.5 speed. And just kind of looking at his frame and build, in the 6'2", 245 realm, I really do think that he profiles more as, that move tight end, that second complementary tight end. Probably going to be a fan favorite wherever he goes, even if he's never, putting up crazy star production. But I think he's a valuable member for any offense, especially an offense that likes to run 12 personnel, because he can do a lot of different things for you. And then also in this tier, obviously we have Jeremy Ruckert, who this time last year I actually thought had a pretty decent chance to be the highest graded tight end in this class. But after reviewing everybody else in this group and some of the more true Y tight ends that I also thought had great blocking ability and they could really stretch the field from that inline spot, I just didn't quite see that same level of versatility with him. I do think that he's more of a second complementary tight end. He's a really good route runner, really good receiver. I think that he's, again, functional as a blocker, but I do not think that he's as physical or as dominating at the point of attack as, say, Cade Otton or Trey McBride or even Jake Ferguson. So I kind of want to use him as that TE2, the big slot, the other guy, just kind of that complementary weapon where, yeah, if it's 3rd and 6, he's going to have a lot of value because he's got good feet, good hips. I do think he's good in the red zone as well. But I just don't see that same kind of, star power, or at least potential for star power, as some of the guys that I have graded above him. And that brings us finally all the way down to Tier 4, which is a group that I have personally labeled as limited role players. These are guys that I do not expect to ever be a starter or even have starter potential. I think that they're complementary tight ends that kind of do certain things really well. If you're trying to mix and match different skill sets in your tight end room, I think all of them bring something to the table, but I don't see any of them as complete enough players to be eventual starters. Somebody that you can really rely on if you're an 11 personnel and you never want to take a tight end off the field, or at least like your main tight end off the field. I don't really ever see any of them as being that type of guy. So just kind of running through this tier really quickly, Isaiah Likely, Garrett Prince, Grant Calcaterra, and James Mitchell, I all see as kind of like complementary big slot type receivers, move tight end types of guys, really guys that only bring a lot of value in the pass game and don't bring a whole lot in the run game at all. Like there are some move tight ends in this class where, I think that they do bring a lot as a blocker, say Chigakonkwo. I don't really see that for any of these guys. Likely, Prince, Calcaterra, and Mitchell, in my opinion, are all really good athletes. I think that they can track the ball down the field well. I think they can do damage after the catch. But like I said, it is more of like a big slot, a tight end in name only type of thing. Likely, in particular, I think has thrown some good blocks out in the edge run game, but if you wanted to dig out a linebacker or, pin a defensive end on crack toss, that's not really his type of thing. So again, limited role players, but I do think that they are good in that limited role of, say, tight end 2, tight end 3, a vertical field stretcher, a yak threat, just a typical hybrid tight end / receiver type role, which is a valuable role in itself. I couldn't quite put them as high as a lot of the guys that I think have more multi-role functionality, so to speak. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got Cole Turner, Daniel Bellinger, and Lucas Kroll, who are all much bigger tight ends. I do think that they profile more as inline tight ends, but they're not really as athletic as a lot of the other inline tight ends, nor are they as good of blockers. Although I do think that Kroll has a lot of size and physicality to him, but again, he brings not a whole lot in the receiving game, in my opinion. I know that he tested well, but I think he looks pretty stiff on tape. I do think that if you kind of get him on the move, on shallow crosses, deep crosses, all that kind of stuff, where he's just basically running in a straight line, he can do some damage that way, but I don't really see him separating down the field from a DB or a linebacker. Daniel Bellinger is also another one of these, kind of developmental inline tight ends. I think that you can bring him in if you want to run like a bunch of wing stuff. If you're the type of team that you want both of your top 2 tight ends to be guys that you can put in line so that you can move the main one around and still feel comfortable with it, I think that Bellinger is that kind of tight end for you. I don't really see the same kind of movement skills, even though he tested well, that would suggest that he could be like an H-back or a move tight end, a big slot, that kind of stuff. I think he is really more of an inline guy, but like a second or third tier inline guy. I think he's solid. I think that he has the potential to be a contributor on a team that likes to run 12 personnel for quite a while, but I just don't really see the dynamism, the vertical speed, any of the kind of stuff that some of the other inline tight ends that I have graded higher than him, all of what they bring to the table, so to speak. But all of that being said, I did kind of lie a little bit. I think there is one guy in this tier that I think could vastly outperform his draft status if he is even drafted at all, and that is Armani Rogers from Ohio / technically UNLV. I put him in limited role players for now because he is a quarterback that is converting to tight end, but I mean, he is the freakiest athlete out of all of these guys. It is pretty insane what he can do. I'm talking 6'5", 230 at the moment, but he's still bulking up. He worked out at UCLA's Pro Day along with Greg Dulcich, and he put up some truly insane numbers. I'm talking mid 4.5 speed, 10.10 in the broad, which is just absurd. And his movement skills are really orders of magnitude better than every other tight end in this class. I first saw him at Shrine Bowl, which was, I'm not even kidding, the first time he had ever run a route in his life. He had not trained for tight end. He had not done any sort of preparation in terms of converting to the position. And yet he showed up first day of practice, again, never having done this before, and he was completely roasting all of the D1 DBs that were out there, like completely uncoverable. And if you had told me that, these were the first routes he had ever run in his life, I wouldn't have believed you. Like, he looked awesome out there. And so that kind of put the league on notice, in my opinion, that, hey, here's this 6'5" freaky athlete that still doesn't even know what he's doing yet, and he's already beating safeties that are going to get drafted, in the middle of the draft. It was just mind-blowing to me. So, again, Armani Rogers, keep his name in the back of your mind. Some people in the NFL think that he could be like another Julius Thomas, another Darren Waller type guy who you're going to get for absolutely nothing in the draft, if he even gets drafted at all. And he might actually end up being the best tight end in this class. I know that sounds insane, but there's a legit shot that happens. So that's going to round out tier 4 for me. Again, a lot of, limited role players, both in terms of move tight ends, big slots, second or third Y tight ends on your roster, special teamers, and then the one lotto ticket that I think every team is kind of keeping one eye on, and that's Armani Rogers. It's a really fun group overall, and like I said at the top, this is probably going to be seen as one of the deepest tight end groups that we've seen in any draft in the last several years. All right, that'll wrap it up for today. That was tier 1 through tier 4 of my tight end rankings. If you want to hear my thoughts on all of the other tight ends that will inevitably be drafted late day 3 or even as UDFAs, once again, head on over to the Bootleg Football Podcast channel. Odds are we might have talked about some of them already, but even if we haven't, we're going to be giving our thoughts on all of them as they get drafted live in real time on draft weekend when we do our draft live streams. So go subscribe there, hang out with us during draft weekend, and same time tomorrow, same place, running back rankings coming at you. And until then, cheers.